Alex Garland. You may know him as the director and writer of Ex Machina, or Annihilation, or the upcoming Men. But he got his start as a novelist, and the novel that really put him on the map was The Beach. Danny Boyle. You might know him from Slumdog Millionaire, Shallow Grave, Trainspotting, Sunshine, Millions, 28 Days Later, or a whole slew of other really, really impressive, amazing films. What they have in common is the book that put Alex Garland on the map, and what I believe is one of the most frustrating adaptations of a book that I have seen and experienced in my life. I'm going to put myself into this situation a little bit and talk about my background as a backpacker and a traveler. In 2002, almost immediately following the towers and a disastrous breakup, I ended up backpacking around Latin America. It was my first long solo trip, and it had indelible marks on my life and who I am as a person. Self-discovery and all that bullshit. In my youth, I had traveled to Canada and around the United States. I had spent a summer in the Dominican Republic representing the Episcopal Church of all things. But Mexico was really the one that put the mark on me, and to this day I maintain a residence here. In 2006, after dealing with the death of my mother and all that entailed for several years, out in the wilds of Connecticut where my parents had retired and I had gone to high school and essentially become furniture at my friend Mark's bar, Nine Ball, dealing with the enormous logistical, emotional, and physical baggage that was my parents' lives, I had needed yet another solo journey to become myself again. Hence, at 30 years old, I packed up my backpack, I booked a flight through LA and Hong Kong over to Thailand, and I did yet another trip of self-discovery. At the time in Southeast Asia, which was a bit more wild than it is now, everywhere you went, there were vendors selling photocopied and bound, very difficult to discern from the original copies of books about traveling. As the author of Malice Ondas, a book about traveling through Latin America, I grew to learn how important these vendors were, wherever backpackers were. I learned also, for the first time in my life, to develop a bit of resentment toward my fellow traveler nation. In Robots, there's an entire chapter where I document the different kinds of travelers, and very low on the list are gurus, the guys who tell you how shit was amazing in Guatemala back in '76 before it got ruined, and let's keep it real, and the Trustafarians, the kids with dreadlocks, usually blonde, usually of European descent, usually on a paid vacation covered by either their government or their parents, with said ill-suiting dreadlocks. It was there that The Beach came to my attention, a book by Alex Garland. I had been aware of the Leonardo DiCaprio, Danny Boyle film, but I had never watched it. But after seeing this thing for months and months in Thailand and Cambodia, Vietnam and Burma, I finally decided to throw down my 400 kip, or whatever the currency at the time was, $2 for a copy of this book. Sorry, Alex Garland. I bought an original since. I read this thing, and I instantly realized why it was such a successful novel. As a member of the Traveler Nation, it simultaneously managed to capture both the allure and the burnout of being a backpacker. Its main character is an English kid on gap year, essentially on a journey of self-discovery that starts in Bangkok. He gradually starts to travel and meets other travelers, and after meeting two funny surfers at a small beach town, hears about a hidden beach, sort of a Shangri-La. He goes to the beach and finds what could be best described as a sort of backpacker, hippie, proto-Burning Man, idealized utopian community. And without ruining the plot, What follows is a descent into what I consider to be one of the best modern-day adaptations of Golding's Lord of the Flies. It is nihilistic, and it is brutal, and the jadedness of someone who is a backpacker and a traveler searching for a quote-unquote real experience permeates the novel. You can practically smell the patchouli. Beyond that, the novel is written in a way that, other than, say, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, which I could not stand, but I must give credit for effectively being written like a screenplay and being compelling and ending on cliffhangers every chapter and moving at a quick pace. I had never run into a book like that had moved at that click and seemed so perfect to adapt for a film. At that point in my life, it spoke to me, and I very much enjoyed it. I read that in Lao, and at that point in my trip, I had been on the road for a few months. I had grown sick of the Trustafarians and the Gurus, of the Khosan Road type places, and I ended up heading over to Cambodia, which, out of all the countries in that region, was my favorite. In no small part because it was, at that time in 2006, it wasn't sanitized in the way that Thailand or even Vietnam were. You went to eat in Siem Reap, and there were tourists who were spending thousands of dollars to stay in luxury hotels and check out Angkor Wat. But at the same time, there were backpackers who were staying in $2 a night hostels. And at the same time, you had the locals who were catering to this tourist mess with children who had missing limbs asking for money and things to eat. What I find gross now and didn't really understand at the time was a lot of the people with more money were what we call war tourists, people who deliberately travel to messed up and war-torn areas. I don't think I need to really explain all the terrible things that are wrong with that. Even there, I met a couple people who were trying to deactivate landmines and who were trying to repair the city, if not the country, from everything the Khmer Rouge had wrecked in their time in power. There was a cellist who I met named B. Cello, who was a doctor who during the Khmer Rouge had opened a children's hospital, which at the time was the best equipped hospital in the country. Every night played cello as an excuse to tell people and teach people about history and help fund that hospital. That shit was amazing. It was in Sihanoukville, in a beach that at the time was fairly real, that I was at a hostel, one where their owner tried to convince me to run it. And on a particularly hungover day, hanging out at the bar with a DVD player and a television and a wide selection of movies, all kind of traveler-based, that I put on the beach and watched it for the first time. People always say you should never read the book before watching an adaptation, and in many cases that's true. But it's usually true because the characters don't look like what you imagined in your head, or the place doesn't look like what you imagined in your head, or the sounds, or any number of visceral things. Occasionally there are plot problems, occasionally there are decisions that are made, things left out for the sake of length. Something like Lord of the Rings would get away with this by putting everything in. But generally, they're sort of predictable problems. If the two forms of storytelling are different enough, they can be appreciated under their own merits. A great example would be The Shining. Stanley Kubrick's The Shining and Stephen King's The Shining are not the same work, and they can be appreciated for being entirely different products. A direct comparison would frustrate you in either direction, as it apparently did Stephen King, who took years to really appreciate Kubrick's adaptation. Then you have cases of things like the Bourne series, where apparently the movies are far better than the books. Thank God for Doug Liman and Matt Damon. The Beach is something else. The Beach is a train wreck. I believe Roger Ebert described the film as some kind of obstacle course for Leonardo DiCaprio to act through. And it is not Leonardo DiCaprio's fault. And to some degree, it is not Danny Boyle's fault. I had the pleasure a couple of years ago of meeting Danny Boyle at the Guanajuato International Film Festival. And I went to his symposium on his films, And when The Beach came up, it was clearly a man that regretted entering the Hollywood system. Up until that point, having done Shallow Grave and Trainspotting and a couple other things, he had not been constrained by overbearing producers. Nor had he really had to deal with the realities of shooting a film abroad. You can read all about it. But for example, in the book, the main character is English, and that is critical to his character. And Danny Boyle was supposed to cast Ewan McGregor, who had been in Shallow Grave and Trainspotting. And it took years for them to reconcile their friendship and working relationship because of how Ewan McGregor was basically pushed aside because the studios wanted someone they could bank more money on and cast Leonardo DiCaprio, who for all of his skills is clearly American. Then, Danny Boyle, as an independent filmmaker, went and shot this film in coastal Thailand, and essentially, as someone who was used to trying to squeeze out every penny possible, but now in the studio system, more or less took advantage of the local population to use as crew for the film. I've been to Koh Phi Phi, and it is gorgeous, which is, of course, the beach that both the book and the film are based on, and where they shot much of the movie. When I was there, this was not that long after the tsunami had hit, and it was actually somewhat of a grim place. Fun, but at the same time, everyone you met knew at least a few people who had died. And if you look at the photo that I'm going to put up here, you can see why. The whole island is thin and narrow, bounded by some small hills. If you're generous, you can call them tiny mountains. When the tsunami hit, way before anyone could wake up, a 40-foot wave washed over this narrow strip of land. The people that it did not immediately wash out to sea were essentially catastrophically injured within their buildings and apartments and bouncing around. At that time, I couldn't go to a bar without several plaques of both locals and foreigners who had died in the tsunami littering the walls. But anyway, Danny Boyle descended on this quaint little island and essentially hired and underpaid the whole island to shoot this film. These are just some of the surface issues I will bring up. And again, I'm not going to spoil the novel. But aside from changing the identities of key characters, aside from Leonardo DiCaprio, Tilda Swinton's character, who is sort of the head of this Burning Man cult on this island, they changed her ethnicity too, as she was American in the novel. There's several characters in the novel that are critical to the plot, let's say 4 or 5 of them, that essentially get reduced to one guy kicking a football down the beach in the movie. But really, the most egregious part of the adaptation, aside from these production things, aside from changing the nationalities and by their nature, how they would culturally impact the understanding of the novel is brutal and nihilistic, and its ending is anything but uplifting or optimistic or positive. It bears more in common with a war journal. The fact that the main character survives it is really the only positive thing that he experiences. Whereas in the film, other than completely stripping the balls off the ending of the novel in the final confrontation, the movie, again without ruining plot points, involves an ending where Leonardo DiCaprio is sitting in some kind of Starbucks hipster cafe, looking at photos of him and his fellow cult members on the beach, and smiling with the fond memories of how things were and could have been. It stinks of studio interference. So I suppose that this video is twofold in its recommendation and lack thereof. I highly recommend picking up a copy of Alex Garlands' The Beach. It is well written, it is well paced, it is compelling, it is perceptive, and it is beautiful in a terrible way. And simultaneously, for one of my favorite directors out there, this is an absolute non-recommendation for the film The Beach. Unless you really want to see, comparing them, how to fuck up an adaptation. If you're the kind of person that likes seeing car crashes, that movie is for you. So that's my video for this week. I apologize for last week's video being so short. I hope you all checked out Red Fang, if only the video for Prehistoric Dog. I had mentioned in the poll, which none of you guys, by the way, have recommended me anything to do for, so please go down and put in something, that I was about to have some news with merch. I'm about to launch some merch on the Patreon channel. And all you guys, at whatever tier you're at, are going to get something. Some little freebie. Whether that's a mug or a t-shirt or a poster, I feel like we have reached enough of a group of people that I want to give you guys something back. I appreciate all of you. I would like to welcome Lakshmi and Nathan, who subscribed recently. Thank you so much for your generosity and for your engagement. And I would like to thank all of you who have been with me either since the beginning or at whatever point in this journey that we've started. Peace, love, and all of that.